Chapter 1. Echoes in the Dust. The Grand Theater loomed like an old sentinel on the edge of the bustling city, its facade weathered by decades of rain and sun, its beauty softened yet still commanding. Inside, beneath the high, arching ceilings and the muted glow of tarnished chandeliers, the building exuded a kind of haunted elegance, the kind that spoke of forgotten splendor and faded dreams. The archivist, Elliot Grayson, moved through its cavernous halls as a ghost might, quietly, with purpose, but unseen by most. Elliot's domain was below the stage, where the glamour of the theater gave way to the cold, unpolished practicality of the archives. Here, amidst an endless sea of boxes and shelves, he tended to the remnants of performances long past. Costumes frayed from age, playbills yellowed and brittle, and photographs that stared back with the frozen expressions of forgotten actors. The air was thick with dust and the faint, lingering scent of parchment, a smell Elliot found oddly comforting. This was his refuge, a world preserved in its imperfections, unchanging, unlike the tumultuous life he had left behind. It was here, in the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights, that Elliot thought himself safe from the world's intrusions. He preferred it that way. People brought complications, and complications brought pain. The archives required nothing from him but his diligence, a quality he possessed in abundance. But even the archives could not shield him entirely from the echoes of life above. That morning, the muffled voices of the directors and actors filtered through the floorboards, their tones sharp with anticipation. A new production was beginning, a classic tragedy that the theater hoped would rekindle its waning prestige. It was the kind of endeavor that drew both seasoned performers and wide-eyed hopefuls alike, all eager to claim their place on the gilded stage. Elliot didn't pay much attention to these proceedings. The theater world, its dramas, its rivalries, its fleeting triumphs, had long since lost its luster for him. He had seen too many dreams dashed, too many performers swept away by the unforgiving tides of the industry. And yet, as he meticulously cataloged a collection of 19th-century playbills, he found himself distracted by a voice. It was faint at first, part of the cacophony above, but soon it grew distinct, clear, and undeniable. The voice was melodic yet raw, carrying a kind of vulnerability that made it stand out. It wasn't the polished perfection of a seasoned actress, but something more. A trembling, heartfelt sincerity that pierced through the layers of wood and stone between them. Against his better judgment, Elliot set down the playbill and moved toward the spiral staircase that connected the archives to the main theater. He ascended quietly, his curiosity pulling him toward the stage like a thread he couldn't quite cut. Peering out from the shadows of the wings, he saw her. She stood at the center of the stage, illuminated by a solitary spotlight. Her auburn hair caught the light like burnished copper, and her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the script. Her voice, now unrestrained, filled the vast emptiness of the theater with a rendition of the tragic monologue. Though she stumbled over a line, she recovered with a grace that spoke of resilience, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears that lent a haunting authenticity to her performance. Elliot's first instinct was to scoff. Another starry-eyed hopeful, he thought, trying to carve out her piece of immortality in a world that would just as soon forget her. But there was something about her, an unpolished sincerity, a rawness that tugged at the frayed edges of his cynicism. Against his will, he found himself rooted in place, unable to look away. When the audition ended, the directors conferred in low voices, their expressions inscrutable. The young woman, Lila Montgomery, as they addressed her, stood with her head held high, though her shoulders betrayed her nervousness. Elliot lingered in the shadows, watching as she left the stage, her footsteps echoing through the empty house. He returned to the archives, but the image of her lingered. Her voice, her presence, even the tremor in her hands. All of it played over in his mind like a song he couldn't silence. He told himself it didn't matter. He would not be drawn into the theater's world again, and certainly not by some idealistic actress who didn't know better than to dream. But as he resumed his work, he caught himself glancing at the staircase, half expecting to hear her voice again. The silence that followed felt heavier somehow, more oppressive. For the first time in years, the archives felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison. And so began the faint stirring of something Elliot had buried long ago. Something he wasn't ready to name. Not yet. Chapter 2. Fragments of a Dream. Elliot Grayson had always believed that the theater, its stage, its glittering lights, its endless parade of hopefuls, was little more than a factory for fleeting illusions. For years, he had kept himself sequestered in the archives, content to unearth the past while ignoring the present. But Lila Montgomery's voice, unrefined yet arresting, had left a crack in the walls he had so carefully constructed. It was a crack he couldn't quite seal, no matter how much he tried. The following morning, Elliot arrived at the theater earlier than usual, the air crisp and laced with the faint promise of rain. The archive room was silent, save for the soft hum of the dehumidifiers. He moved mechanically, his hands tracing the edges of ancient playbills and fragile photographs, but his focus was elsewhere. The image of Lila standing beneath the spotlight had embedded itself in his mind like a persistent melody. He found himself replaying her performance in his head, noticing every inflection, every tremor, every moment she seemed to pour her heart into the words. It frustrated him. Why did he care? She was just another actress chasing an ephemeral dream, one that would likely crumble under the weight of reality. And yet, there was something about her that lingered, defying his attempts to dismiss her as just another fleeting presence. Midway through his morning's work, Elliot was startled by a knock on the door. Visitors to the archives were rare, and he typically preferred it that way. He hesitated, debating whether to ignore it, but the knock came again, soft yet insistent. Sighing, he pushed back his chair and opened the door. There she was, standing in the dim light of the corridor, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. Lila Montgomery. "Hi," she said, clutching a leather-bound notebook against her chest. Her auburn hair was tied back in a loose braid, and she wore a simple cardigan that made her seem more approachable than the luminous figure he'd seen on stage. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Elliot blinked, momentarily at a loss for words. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone cooler than he intended. "I was told you're the archivist," she said, her voice steady despite his brusque demeanor. "I wanted to learn more about the play, the history, the original production, anything that might help me understand it better." Elliot raised an eyebrow. Most performers barely glanced at the script beyond their lines, let alone sought out the archives. "The archives aren't exactly light reading," he said, gesturing to the labyrinth of shelves behind him. Lila's smile widened slightly. "I don't mind. I think understanding the context can make a performance more authentic. Don't you?" Her earnestness caught him off guard. For a moment, he considered turning her away, retreating to his solitude. But something about the determination in her eyes, a spark of curiosity and vulnerability, made him step aside. "All right," he said. "Come in." The room seemed to shrink as Lila entered, her presence filling the space in a way that made Elliot acutely aware of how small his sanctuary truly was. She looked around, her eyes widening as they took in the rows of shelves, the neatly labeled boxes, and the delicate artifacts displayed under glass. "This is incredible," she said, her voice tinged with awe. "It's like stepping into another world." Elliot said nothing, unsure how to respond. Instead, he led her to a small reading table near the back of the room. He pulled a worn book from one of the shelves and placed it in front of her. "This is the program from the play's original production," he said. "It includes notes from the director and some photographs of the cast. It might give you some insight." Lila's eyes lit up as she opened the book, her fingers tracing the faded ink and yellowed pages. She read silently for a moment before looking up at him. "You must love this," she said. "Preserving all these stories, keeping them alive." Elliot hesitated, unsure how to answer. Love wasn't a word he associated with his work. It was a job, a responsibility, a way to stay hidden. "It's what I do," he said finally. Lila tilted her head, studying him with a curiosity that made him uncomfortable. "You don't seem like the type to settle for just doing something. There's more to it, isn't there?" Elliot felt a flicker of irritation. "Why does it matter?" he asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Lila didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled softly, her expression tinged with understanding. "Because I think people, even those who hide, have a reason for what they do. And maybe, if you figure out what that reason is, it'll help you understand yourself better." Her words hung in the air, challenging and disarming all at once. Elliot felt an unfamiliar unease stirring within him, a sense of being seen in a way he hadn't allowed anyone to see him in years. He didn't like it. "If you need anything else," he said stiffly, "let me know. Otherwise, I have work to do." Lila nodded, her smile undimmed. "Thank you, Elliot." "Really?" As she turned her attention back to the program, Elliot retreated to his desk, his thoughts a tangled web of irritation and intrigue. Lila Montgomery was a puzzle he hadn't asked to solve, but she had a way of slipping past his defenses, leaving him unsettled in her wake. For the rest of the day, her presence lingered in the archives like a shadow, quiet yet impossible to ignore. And though he wouldn't admit it, Elliot found himself glancing at her more often than he cared to, as if drawn to her light, even as he tried to remain in the dark. Chapter 3. The Curtain Between Us. The scent of aged wood and faintly lingering grease paint filled the theater's backstage corridors, a stark contrast to the polished elegance of the auditorium. Oliver maneuvered through the maze with practiced ease, each step landing softly on the worn floorboards. He carried an armful of antique programs, remnants of performances long past, destined for archival. His mind was still entangled with images of Celeste, her expression as she delivered Desdemona's plea, her voice resonating like a bow drawn across the strings of his guarded heart. The Archivist's sanctuary, a modest office lined with rows of meticulously organized shelves, awaited him. His desk was a fortress of papers, books, and sepia-toned photographs that chronicled the theater's storied past. Oliver found solace in this space, its silence insulating him from the tumult of the world outside. Yet, today, the silence felt unnervingly brittle, as though a single stray thought might shatter it. He set the programs down and turned to the window that overlooked the bustling streets below. Winter sunlight spilled through the glass, illuminating the dust motes in golden light. He watched the passers-by without seeing them, his thoughts still consumed by Celeste. There was a vitality in her that defied his carefully constructed cynicism, a fire he couldn't extinguish with his usual arsenal of detached observations. His brooding was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. "Come in," he called, turning reluctantly from the window. It was Margaret, the theater's stage manager, her demeanor brisk and no-nonsense as always. "Oliver, have you seen the cast list?" she asked, stepping inside and shutting the door firmly behind her. She held a clipboard in one hand, her brow furrowed with irritation. "Not yet." "Why?" he replied, leaning against the edge of his desk. "The director's gone and cast Celeste Laurent as Desdemona." Margaret's tone was clipped, her disapproval evident. Oliver blinked, momentarily stunned. "She got the role?" "Yes, and half the company is up in arms about it." They're saying she's inexperienced, a risk to the production. Frankly, I'm inclined to agree. Oliver's mind raced. He'd seen the whispers of brilliance in Celeste's audition, the raw emotion she brought to every line. Yet, casting her as Desdemona was a bold choice, one bound to stoke resentment among the veteran actors. "Have you spoken to the director?" he asked carefully. Margaret sighed. "Martin claims he sees something special in her. He's convinced she'll rise to the occasion, but I have my doubts. She's a wild card, Oliver. If she stumbles, this entire production could unravel." Oliver's lips curved into a faint, sardonic smile. "Risk is the essence of art, isn't it?" Margaret shot him a withering look. "Don't romanticize this. We're running a professional company, not an experiment." She left soon after, leaving Oliver alone with his thoughts. He'd always preferred observing from the wings, his presence unobtrusive. But now, for reasons he couldn't quite name, he found himself drawn to Celeste's journey, her audacity to dream, her defiance in the face of doubt. Later that evening, as rehearsals commenced, Oliver found himself lingering in the shadows of the stage. The actors milled about, voices mingling in a cacophony of dialogue and laughter. Celeste stood apart, clutching her script with trembling hands. Gone was the confident performer he'd seen at the audition. In her place was a young woman battling nerves. As the rehearsal began, Martin's voice echoed through the cavernous space, urging the actors to immerse themselves in their roles. Celeste stepped forward hesitantly, her voice faltering on the opening lines of Desdemona's speech. Laughter rippled through the company, a sharp blade that sliced through her composure. Oliver's chest tightened. He'd seen this before. The cruelty of the stage, the way it could lay bare a performer's insecurities. And yet, even as her voice quivered, there was a resilience in Celeste's posture, a refusal to retreat. "Enough," Martin barked, silencing the murmurs. "Let's take it from the top." The rehearsal dragged on, the air heavy with unspoken judgments. When it finally ended, Celeste lingered, her shoulders slumped in exhaustion. Oliver watched her from his vantage point in the wings, debating whether to approach. Before he could decide, she turned and caught sight of him. "You're still here," she said, her voice tinged with surprise. "I have nowhere else to be," he replied, stepping out of the shadows. "You did well for your first rehearsal." Her laugh was bitter. "You don't have to lie. I could hear the snickers as clearly as everyone else. And yet you didn't crumble," he observed. "That's more than most can say." Celeste's gaze softened, her guard lowering. "Why are you being kind to me, Mr. March?" He hesitated, caught off guard by the question. Finally, he said, "Because I've seen what this place can do to people. You have talent, Celeste. Don't let them convince you otherwise." For a moment, she looked at him as though trying to decipher a puzzle. Then she smiled, a small but genuine gesture that lit up her face. "Thank you," she said softly. As she walked away, Oliver felt an unfamiliar warmth unfurling within him. He'd come to the theater seeking solitude, a refuge from the messiness of human connection. Yet, in Celeste's determination, he saw a glimmer of something he'd thought long lost: hope. Chapter 4. Fractured Reflections. The archives remained a sanctuary for Felix, a space cloaked in shadows and silence, where memories of past performances lived on in forgotten scripts and yellowed photographs. It was an unassuming realm, and yet it felt alive to him. A labyrinth of secrets woven into the very fabric of the theater. Amid its unlit corners and the scent of aged paper, he found solace from the chaos outside. Or at least, he had, until the arrival of Evelyn Locke began to chip away at his peace. It had been 3 days since Evelyn's unexpected visit to the archives. Felix had replayed their encounter countless times, dissecting her words, her expressions, and the way her presence lingered even after she was gone. She'd left behind more than an air of curiosity. There was an energy, a vibrancy that clung to the space as if it had been waiting for someone like her to breathe life into it. Yet Felix couldn't decide whether this intrusion was a welcome one. On this particular afternoon, he sat at his desk, his back to the door, hunched over a collection of programs from the theater's golden age. The faint hum of activity upstairs filtered through the floorboards. A rehearsal, no doubt. He recognized the fragmented strains of dialogue and the occasional burst of laughter, punctuated by the director's authoritative bark. As much as Felix claimed to despise the performers and their relentless noise, he couldn't help but listen. "Felix." The sound of her voice startled him. He turned sharply, knocking over a stack of loose papers. There she was, standing in the doorway, her figure framed by the dim glow of the hall beyond. Evelyn Locke's presence seemed out of place in the dusty archive, like a sunbeam breaking through storm clouds. "You again," he muttered, stooping to gather the fallen papers. Evelyn stepped inside, her boots clicking against the wooden floor. "Sorry for the intrusion," she said, though her tone suggested anything but regret. "I've been thinking about your offer." Felix straightened, clutching the papers to his chest. "Offer? You said I should come back if I wanted to learn about the theater's history." He frowned. Had he said that? He'd been too flustered by her sudden appearance the first time to recall his exact words. "I didn't expect you to take me seriously." "Well, I am serious," she replied, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "I want to understand this place, really understand it. I think it might help me connect with my role." Felix sighed. "I'm not a tour guide." "Good. I'm not looking for one." She held his gaze, and for a moment, neither spoke. There was a challenge in her eyes, a quiet determination that Felix found unsettling. With a reluctant nod, he gestured to a nearby chair. "Sit. If we're doing this, we might as well start with the basics." Evelyn's smile was triumphant but not gloating. She perched on the edge of the chair, leaning forward as if she couldn't wait to absorb every word he said. Felix found her enthusiasm both baffling and infectious. "This theater has a long history," he began, settling back into his own chair. "It's seen its share of triumphs and tragedies, both on and off the stage. The archives are a testament to that. Every performance, every actor, every scandal. It's all here, preserved for posterity." "What about the ghost stories?" Evelyn asked, her eyes twinkling with mischief. Felix raised an eyebrow. "Ghost stories? I've heard the cast whispering about them. They say this place is haunted by the spirits of actors who died before their final curtain call." He snorted. "Superstitious nonsense. The only ghosts here are the ones we create in our minds. You don't believe in that sort of thing?" "I believe in facts, Miss Locke. The rest is just theater." Evelyn didn't argue, but her knowing smile suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. As the afternoon wore on, Felix found himself drawn into her orbit despite his better judgment. He spoke of the theater's founding, its evolution over the decades, and the iconic performances that had graced its stage. Evelyn listened intently, her questions probing and thoughtful. She wasn't merely humoring him. She genuinely cared. For her part, Evelyn was equally captivating. She spoke of her struggles in the industry, the countless auditions that had ended in rejection, and the moments of doubt that had nearly driven her to give up. Yet through it all, she had held onto her love for the craft, a love that seemed to burn brighter with each setback. By the time she rose to leave, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the archive. Felix walked her to the door, an unfamiliar sense of reluctance tugging at him. "Thank you," she said, pausing in the doorway, "for sharing all of that with me. It means a lot." He nodded, unsure how to respond. As she disappeared down the hall, her laughter echoing faintly behind her, Felix returned to his desk. The room felt different now, as if her presence had stirred something long dormant within its walls and within him. For the first time in years, the silence of the archives didn't feel so comforting. It felt empty. Chapter 5: Threads of Vulnerability. The days leading up to the final callbacks for Elysian Descent transformed the theater into a living, breathing tempest. The air hummed with a unique electricity, a potent mixture of hope, dread, and desperation. Actors rehearsed their monologues in hushed whispers along the hallways. The corridors echoed with the tapping of hurried steps, and the faint scent of sawdust from freshly constructed props permeated the space. Yet, for Lucien, these theatrics unfolded like a familiar, predictable script, or so he thought. He found himself once again tucked in the archives, his fortress of solitude. The shadows of 1,000 forgotten performances seemed to watch over him as he worked, meticulously cataloging vintage playbills. His hands moved with mechanical precision, but his mind wandered, betraying his usual discipline. A lingering thought had taken root, one that he couldn't quite shake. Celine, her audition had been unlike anything he'd seen before, though he had tried to convince himself otherwise. The raw vulnerability in her voice, the way she wielded every line as though it were drawn from her soul, had stirred something deep within him. He'd watched countless performances, yet this one refused to fade into the recesses of memory. Worse still, he'd begun to hear her voice not only in the archives, but in the silence of his own thoughts. The creak of the archive door shattered his reverie. Lucien looked up to find Celine standing in the doorway, her expression a mixture of hesitancy and resolve. The light from the hallway framed her like a vignette, the faintest hint of golden dust motes swirling around her. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, her voice softer than he remembered. Lucien placed the playbill he'd been holding back on the desk. "That depends," he said, his tone even. "Are you here to find something, or lose yourself?" Her lips curved into a half-smile, a touch of defiance in her eyes. "Maybe both." She stepped inside, letting the door close behind her. "I was told the archives hold scripts from past productions. I thought it might help to immerse myself in the character." "A noble pursuit," Lucien replied, gesturing vaguely to the towering shelves. Though immersion often comes at the cost of clarity, she tilted her head, studying him. "And what would you know about clarity, Lucien? You seem content to bury yourself here, surrounded by shadows and dust. When was the last time you stepped into the light?" Her words landed like a challenge. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Perhaps some of us find the light overrated." Celine approached the desk, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. She rested her hands on the edge, her gaze unwavering. "Or perhaps some of us are simply afraid of what we'd see." For a moment, silence stretched between them, taut and electric. Lucien's usual retorts failed him, her audacity catching him off guard. But instead of pushing her away, he found himself intrigued. There was something disarming about her, a mix of boldness and sincerity that chipped away at his defenses. "What is it you're looking for?" he asked finally, his voice softer than before. Celine's expression shifted, the defiance giving way to something more vulnerable. "I want to understand her," she said. "Alicia, the character. She's so layered, so tragic. I feel like there's more to her story than what's on the page." Lucien regarded her thoughtfully. Without a word, he rose from his chair and walked toward one of the shelves. His fingers skimmed the spines of leather-bound scripts until he found what he was looking for. He returned to the desk and placed a worn volume in front of her. "This is the original manuscript," he said. "The playwright's notes are in the margins. It might give you the perspective you're searching for." Celine's eyes lit up as she ran her fingers over the faded cover. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. As she opened the manuscript, Lucien watched her, his cynicism momentarily eclipsed by curiosity. She read with an intensity that mirrored her performances, her brow furrowing as she absorbed the words. It was as though she was peeling back the layers of the character, and in doing so, revealing parts of herself. "Why do you care so much?" he asked suddenly, the question escaping before he could stop it. She looked up, startled by the vulnerability in his voice. "Because I see myself in her," she admitted. "Her struggles, her fears, her longing to be understood. Acting isn't just a performance for me. It's a way to make sense of the chaos inside." Lucien's chest tightened at her words. He'd spent so long building walls, convincing himself that emotions were a weakness, that vulnerability only led to pain. Yet here she was, laying herself bare with a courage he couldn't fathom. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "you're braver than most." Celine smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "Or perhaps I'm just reckless." The moment lingered, a fragile connection forming between them. Lucien felt the weight of his own defenses, the armor he'd worn for so long, beginning to crack. For the first time in years, he wondered what it might feel like to step out of the shadows. Celine closed the manuscript and stood, cradling it against her chest. "Thank you, Lucien, for this, and for listening." He nodded, his voice caught somewhere between his heart and throat. As she walked toward the door, he found himself watching her, the faintest glimmer of hope stirring in the depths of his guarded soul. When the door clicked shut, the archives felt quieter than ever, as though the shadows themselves were holding their breath. Lucien returned to his chair, but the playbill in his hands remained untouched. For the first time in years, the ghosts of the past seemed less oppressive, their whispers drowned out by a new, unfamiliar melody, one that carried the promise of something more. Chapter 6: The Phantom Song. The grand rehearsal room was a space where magic and madness collided. With its high vaulted ceilings, scuffed wooden floors, and massive mirrored wall, it was both sanctuary and battlefield for the actors who poured their souls into it. That morning, Celine stood at the center of the room, clutching her copy of the Elysian Descent script. Her reflection stared back at her, determined but tinged with a flicker of self-doubt. A dozen other hopefuls milled about, exchanging pleasantries or nervously rehearsing lines under their breath. The energy in the room was palpable, a heady blend of ambition and apprehension, but Celine had grown adept at tuning out the noise, drawing her focus inward. For her, each line was a puzzle, each gesture a key. Today's rehearsal wasn't just about the character. It was about survival in an industry where opportunities were fleeting. "Everyone, to your places," boomed the voice of Émile Laurent, the theater's notoriously demanding director. The group shuffled into position as Émile strode into the room, his long scarf trailing behind him like a general's banner. His sharp eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail with surgical precision. Celine inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of his gaze as it briefly lingered on her. She knew Émile's reputation. A master of the craft, but merciless in his pursuit of perfection. There were whispers that his critiques had driven actors to tears, or worse, to abandon the stage altogether. "We'll begin with Act 2, Scene 4, Émile announced, snapping his fingers. "The pivotal confrontation. This scene will define who earns the role of Alicia. I need fire. I need vulnerability. I need truth." Celine stepped forward, her heart pounding in her chest. Across from her stood Marcus Grayson, a seasoned actor auditioning for the role of Alicia's ill-fated lover, Selim. He gave her a quick nod, his expression calm and assured. Celine envied his composure, but refused to let it intimidate her. The scene began, and the room fell silent. Celine launched into her lines with a fervor that surprised even herself. She channeled every ounce of fear, longing, and betrayal she'd felt in her own life, weaving it into the fabric of Alicia's grief. Her voice cracked in just the right places, her movements raw yet deliberate. She was no longer Celine. She was Alicia, a woman on the precipice of heartbreak and ruin. Across from her, Marcus delivered his lines with practiced elegance. He was precise, every word carefully enunciated, every gesture controlled. Yet there was something missing, a spark that failed to ignite. Celine could sense it, and so, it seemed, could Emile. The director's frown deepened as the scene progressed. "Stop!" Emile's voice cut through the air, halting the performance midline. He strode toward Marcus, his eyes blazing. "Grayson, where's the desperation? The agony? You're playing a man who knows he's about to lose everything, and yet you deliver your lines as if ordering coffee at a cafe. Do it again." From the top, Celine caught Marcus's brief glance, a flash of frustration flickering behind his mask of professionalism. They restarted the scene, but the tension between them was palpable. This time, Marcus pushed harder, his voice rising, his gestures more dramatic. But the result was overwrought, a performance that felt hollow despite its volume. Emile groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Enough. You're trying too hard. Acting is not about trying. It's about being." His gaze shifted to Celine. "And you, Celine, you have the vulnerability, but where's the fire? Where is the Alicia who would burn the world to ashes for love?" Celine's cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth to respond, but Emile raised a hand to silence her. "Words mean nothing. Show me, both of you. Show me what it means to shatter." The room held its breath as Emile stepped back, his presence looming like a storm cloud. Celine met Marcus's eyes, and for the first time, she saw uncertainty there. It was a crack in his armor, and it gave her strength. This time, when the scene began, Celine let go of every pretense. She thought of the nights she'd spent alone, questioning her worth, the rejections that had left her hollow. She thought of the brief, unspoken moments with Lucien that had stirred something she couldn't name. The emotions surged to the surface, untamed and relentless. "You don't understand," she cried, her voice trembling. "I gave you everything, and still, it was never enough. Do you know what it's like to love someone who only sees the world in pieces?" Marcus hesitated, caught off guard by her intensity. But Celine pressed on, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You shattered me, Selim, and now I'm the one who has to pick up the pieces." For a moment, Marcus was silent, his lines forgotten. The room seemed to hang in suspended animation, every pair of eyes fixed on Celine. Then, as if compelled by some unseen force, Marcus responded, not with words, but with a raw, guttural cry that echoed through the room. The scene took on a life of its own, the boundaries between acting and reality blurring. When it ended, the room erupted into applause. Emile said nothing, his expression unreadable, but the faintest glimmer of approval flickered in his eyes. Celine's chest heaved as she caught her breath, the weight of the performance settling over her like a heavy cloak. As the applause died down, Emile finally spoke. "Celine," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "That was truth." A flush of pride warmed her cheeks, but she kept her composure. Emile turned to Marcus, who nodded solemnly, accepting the unspoken critique. Rehearsal ended shortly after, and the actors dispersed, their whispered conversations filling the hall. As Celine gathered her belongings, she felt a presence behind her. "You have fire," Lucien's voice murmured. She turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his usual guarded demeanor tinged with something softer. Celine smiled, her heart skipping a beat. "And you have shadows," she replied, tilting her head. "Perhaps we'll both learn something from each other." He didn't reply, but his gaze lingered, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. As he disappeared into the dimly lit corridor, Celine couldn't help but wonder if her greatest performance was yet to come. Not on the stage, but in the delicate dance unfolding between herself and the enigmatic Archivist. Chapter 7. A Dance of Shadows. The Archivist stood in the dim light of the vault, the towering shelves stretching far above him. In his hands, he held the final volume of the Forgotten Texts, a collection of whispers bound in fragile leather. He had traversed the winding labyrinth of the archive for countless days, piecing together the broken fragments of a past long obscured by time and secrecy. His mission had never been clearer: to find the truth buried within these pages, to uncover the knowledge that had been sealed away for so long. Yet, now, as he reached for the last manuscript, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed in the archive itself. The air was thick with silence, and it wasn't the comfortable kind of silence, one of stillness, the peace of unspoken knowledge, but rather an oppressive kind, heavy with unacknowledged things. His fingers hesitated over the cover of the volume, as though it might slip from his grasp and vanish into the ether. He had been through many versions of this same moment, finding something that led to more questions, more mysteries. But this time, there was an unease in the air, a pull that seemed to draw him toward the hidden corners of the archive he had not dared venture into before. The Archivist's eyes darted to the farthest reaches of the room, where shadows clung to the edges of the light, forming shapes that seemed almost human. Just my imagination, he thought, though the sensation of being watched persisted, gnawing at his every step. With a deep breath, he opened the book, the crackling sound of old parchment filling the void. The language was strange, foreign in its structure, but he recognized the pattern. These were the words that had been lost, the ones the Auditioner had been searching for. He could feel the pull of those words as they twisted through his mind, the edges of his consciousness fraying as the familiar grip of the text took hold. He had read many texts here, each one with its own flavor of ancient knowledge, but this was different. This text was alive. As his eyes tracked the symbols on the page, they seemed to move, to writhe beneath his gaze. The meaning was always just out of reach, a shimmering veil that he could almost pierce, but not quite. The Archivist's breath quickened, and his heart beat louder in the stillness of the room. There was no sound but the rustle of the pages and his own pulse. He didn't know how long he had been there when the door to the archive creaked open behind him, a disturbance in the air so subtle that, at first, he wondered if he had imagined it. But the sensation of presence was unmistakable. Turning slowly, the Archivist saw the Auditioner standing in the doorway, framed by the dim light of the hall behind them. The figure was bathed in shadows, yet the Auditioner's eyes shone with an unnatural gleam. The Archivist had known they would come, eventually, but there was something about the way the Auditioner stood there now, silent, watching, that made him hesitate. The room seemed to contract, the space between them growing thin as the air thickened, charged with a tension that had been building for days, weeks, maybe even months. The Archivist's fingers tightened around the book, feeling the weight of its contents press against him. He wasn't sure if the Auditioner had come for answers or for something more, but in that moment, it didn't matter. For the first time in his life, the Archivist felt as though he had stumbled upon something that might not be meant for discovery, something that might forever alter the balance between what was known and what was hidden. The Auditioner stepped forward, their voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "You've found it, haven't you?" they asked softly, their tone both curious and knowing. The Archivist didn't respond immediately. Instead, he closed the book with a decisive snap, the sound echoing through the vault, then turned to face the Auditioner fully. For a long moment, neither of them moved, and the weight of the archive pressed down on them both. "I have," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not what I expected." The auditioner's eyes glinted with an almost predatory gleam, and they took another step closer, as though drawn in by the force of his words. "It never is," they replied, their voice thick with understanding. "The question is, Archivist, are you ready to hear it?" The Archivist swallowed, his throat dry, his mind racing. He had come so far, had uncovered so much, but now, as the door between him and the truth swung wide open, he wondered if he was ready to cross that threshold. The room seemed to pulse, the walls stretching and contracting, and for a moment, the Archivist was aware of nothing but the weight of his decision. Would he step forward into the unknown, embracing the secrets that lay ahead? Or would he turn back, leave the mysteries untouched, and protect the fragile boundary between the known and the lost? As if sensing his hesitation, the auditioner took one last step until they were standing directly in front of him. "We both know you can't walk away now," they murmured, their voice a quiet, compelling force. And with that, the Archivist's resolve hardened. He nodded once, slowly, and without another word, he stepped toward the door that would lead him deeper into the archive than he had ever gone before. Chapter 8. The Stage Whispers. The door closed behind them with a soft but final thud, leaving the Archivist and the auditioner in near-complete darkness. The flickering of the old lamps that lined the archive's walls barely penetrated the suffocating gloom. The air was dense with dust, untouched by time, as though the space itself had been waiting for them, for this exact moment. Every step the Archivist took seemed to echo louder in the silence, each footfall stirring the forgotten fragments of the world around him. For a brief moment, he considered turning back, but he had already crossed too many thresholds, opened too many doors, to simply walk away now. Something had changed inside him. The desire to understand, to piece together the fractured remnants of history, was stronger than any fear or uncertainty that lingered at the edges of his thoughts. The auditioner, though, remained as calm and still as ever. They walked beside him, neither rushing nor dragging their feet, as if this journey, this final descent into the heart of the archive, was nothing more than the next step in a path they had long been familiar with. They did not speak at first, and the Archivist could not bring himself to break the silence. There were no words to describe the weight of what they were walking toward. He could feel the knowledge, untold, ancient, and unimaginable, hovering just beyond the edges of his consciousness. The deeper they moved into the archive, the more oppressive the darkness became. The walls narrowed, and the air grew heavier, as though the very fabric of reality itself was tightening around them. The Archivist's breath came quicker now, shallow and uneven. He had felt this before, in fleeting moments when the archive seemed to reveal more than it should, when the knowledge he uncovered felt almost too alive, too potent, as though the space itself had become conscious of its own existence. He glanced at the auditioner. Their face was obscured in shadow, but their eyes glowed faintly, like embers burning in the dark. The Archivist had never been able to determine whether those eyes were a gift or a curse. They seemed to see through everything, to peel back the layers of time and reality until nothing was hidden from them. What are we really searching for? The question slipped from the Archivist's lips before he could stop it, a simple query that had been on his mind since the moment the auditioner had first arrived at the archive. The auditioner's steps faltered for a fraction of a second, and then they continued forward, as though they had been expecting the question. "You know the answer to that," they replied, their voice a soft murmur in the suffocating dark. "But you don't want to admit it." The Archivist swallowed, his throat suddenly tight. He had spent so much time chasing the truth, chasing knowledge, that he had never stopped to think about what it would mean to uncover everything. The truth was not a simple thing to hold. It was like holding fire in your hands, like trying to capture the sun. "I'm not sure I'm ready for it," he said, his voice barely audible. The auditioner stopped then, turning to face him fully. "No one ever is," they said, "but you will be. In time." They reached out, placing a hand on the archivist's arm, and for a moment, he felt a surge of warmth, something both reassuring and unsettling. Their touch was steady, their presence unyielding. The archivist took a deep breath, steadying himself. There was no turning back now. He had known from the moment he had first crossed the threshold into the archive that there would be no going back, no returning to the simplicity of ignorance. He had entered a space where the boundaries of time, space, and understanding had no meaning, and where the answers he sought might be far more than he could ever truly comprehend. Together, they descended further, deeper into the bowels of the archive, passing rows upon rows of forgotten knowledge. The shelves here were older, the texts even more fragile, as though they had not seen the light of day for centuries. The archivist ran his fingers along one of the shelves, feeling the weight of the past pressing against his skin. "There's something else," he said suddenly, his mind racing. "I can feel it. Something different about this place. Something alive." The auditioner did not respond immediately, but the archivist could sense their eyes on him. He turned to look at them, but they had already turned away, their gaze fixed on the distant horizon of the archive's depths. "Alive," the auditioner repeated, their voice low. "Yes, in a sense, but it is not what you think. The archive is not a place. It is a being, a consciousness. It exists beyond the confines of time and space. It remembers everything, and it feels everything. It has seen the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of stars, and the unfolding of countless lives." The archivist froze, the words sinking into him like stones dropped into still water. A consciousness? The archive was more than just a repository of knowledge. It was alive, sentient. His mind reeled, unable to fully grasp the implications of what the auditioner had just said. What does it want? The question escaped his lips before he could stop it. The auditioner turned to face him fully now, their eyes bright in the dark. "It wants the same thing you do," they said softly. "To be understood. To be remembered." For a long moment, the archivist stood in the dark, trying to make sense of what the auditioner had just revealed. The archive, alive, remembering, feeling. It was almost too much to bear. He had spent his life searching for knowledge, believing that the truth was just a collection of facts to be discovered, filed away, and studied. But this, the reality of what he was standing in, was something far greater, far more terrifying than anything he had imagined. And yet, in his heart, he knew he could not turn back. The truth was calling to him, pulling him forward, deeper into the unknown. The archivist stepped forward once more, the auditioner close behind him. Ahead, the darkness opened up into a vast chamber, and within it, something pulsed with an ancient energy. Chapter 9. Shattered Soliloquies. The vast chamber opened before them, an infinite expanse stretching beyond what the archivist could comprehend. It was not like any room he had seen before. This was not merely a space, but an entity unto itself. The walls were not walls at all, but layers of swirling mist that glowed faintly in shades of gold and violet, shifting like the memory of a dream. The air was thick, charged with something ancient, something that hummed beneath his skin, a frequency too subtle to hear, but too powerful to ignore. The archivist took a hesitant step into the chamber, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. It was as if the very atmosphere was alive, responding to his presence, acknowledging him as something more than just an intruder. His breath caught in his throat as he tried to make sense of what lay ahead. "Is this the heart of the archive?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. as though speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate balance of the space. The auditioner, who had remained silent as they walked deeper into the room, finally spoke. Their voice was a soft murmur, almost drowned out by the hum of the chamber, but it carried a weight that seemed to ground the very air around them. "This is not just the heart of the archive," the auditioner said, their words laced with both reverence and caution. "This is the core. The archive does not just store knowledge. It creates it. It is both the keeper and the source, the wellspring from which all truths flow. It is alive, in a way that transcends your understanding." The archivist's mind raced as he absorbed the auditioner's words. He had always thought of the archive as a place, a sacred repository of knowledge, a silent guardian of the past. But now, in the presence of this space, he realized how wrong he had been. This was no mere collection of books and scrolls. It was an organism, vast and interconnected, a living thing that pulsed with the energy of untold knowledge, of time itself. He looked around, trying to grasp the full scope of the chamber. There were no physical bookshelves here, no neatly organized rows of scrolls. Instead, the walls of the chamber seemed to be woven from the very fabric of memory. Shifting patterns of light and shadow formed into images, scenes from forgotten times, glimpses of histories that had never been recorded, faces of people long gone but not forgotten. Some of the images were clear, vibrant with life, while others were faint, almost imperceptible, as though the archive itself was trying to remember them, but the details had slipped through its fingers. It was as if the very air was saturated with the essence of every story ever told, every whisper of truth ever uttered. The archivist could feel the pull of those images, could hear the faint murmur of voices that seemed to rise from the walls themselves. They were not speaking in a language he recognized, but he understood them nonetheless. They were speaking in the language of memory, of essence, of things that existed beyond the limits of human comprehension. He stepped closer to one of the glowing walls, reaching out a hand to touch the surface. As his fingers made contact, the air around him seemed to shimmer, and the wall rippled like water, revealing an image of a vast city, its spires stretching up into the heavens, its streets teeming with life. He could feel the pulse of the city's heartbeat, the rhythm of its existence. He could sense the laughter of children in the streets, the murmur of merchants haggling in the market, the low hum of distant conversations. He could feel the weight of 1,000 stories, the lives of countless individuals who had once walked those streets. The archivist recoiled, his hand trembling as he pulled it back. The image faded, dissolving into the wall as though it had never been there. He stared at the place where it had been, his mind reeling. "What was that?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "That was only one of many memories," the auditioner replied, their tone distant, as though they, too, were lost in the reverie of the archive's power. The archive does not merely store knowledge. It remembers it. Everything, every moment, every thought, every breath ever taken. The archivist turned to face the auditioner, his eyes wide with disbelief. "But how? How can something remember everything?" The auditioner did not answer immediately. Instead, they stepped forward, their movements graceful and fluid, as though they were one with the space itself. They approached the center of the chamber, where a swirling vortex of light and shadow seemed to converge. It was here that the hum of the archive's energy was at its strongest, a constant, pulsing rhythm that resonated with the very core of his being. "This is where it all begins," the auditioner said, their voice reverberating with an odd resonance. "The archive is not just a collection of knowledge. It is the conduit between the known and the unknown. It is the link between the past, the present, and the future. It contains everything that has ever been and everything that will be. The question is not whether the archive remembers. It's whether you are ready to understand what it holds." The archivist felt a chill run down his spine as the auditioner's words settled in. He had never imagined that the archive was something so vast, so alive. He had thought it a quiet keeper of forgotten truths, but now he understood that it was something far more dangerous and far more powerful than he had ever realized. He stepped closer to the center of the chamber, his heart pounding in his chest. The swirling vortex before him seemed to beckon, its light pulling him in, offering him access to all the knowledge he had ever sought. But as he reached out, something within him hesitated. There was something wrong about it, something off. The desire for knowledge was strong, but the fear of what it might cost him was even stronger. The auditioner turned to face him, their expression unreadable. "You are not afraid, are you?" they asked, their voice laced with an unspoken challenge. The archivist opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. The vortex before him pulsed again, more urgently this time, and for the first time, he realized that it was not merely beckoning him, it was waiting for him to make the choice that would either bind him to the archive forever or set him free. And in that moment, the archivist understood that there was no turning back. Whatever lay ahead, he had already crossed the point of no return. The knowledge, the power, the truth, it was all within his reach. But what price would he pay for it? Chapter 10. The spotlight's glare. The vortex at the center of the chamber pulsed again, this time with greater force, sending a tremor through the air. The archivist could feel it deep in his bones, the pull of something ancient, something powerful. It was as if the archive itself was reaching out to him, urging him to take the final step, to cross the threshold that would bind him to its infinite depths. The auditioner stood silently beside him, watching, waiting, their face unreadable in the dim light. Their presence was both comforting and unnerving, as though they were not just a guide, but a part of the archive itself. They were here to witness the moment of choice, but perhaps in some way, they were also a part of the test that the archive had set before him. The archivist's heart raced. The weight of the decision before him was suffocating. All his life, he had sought knowledge, unwavering in his pursuit, relentless in his quest to uncover the forgotten truths of the world. He had come so far, descended so deeply into the archive's labyrinth, that the idea of turning back now seemed impossible. The promise of answers, of the truth, was too alluring to resist. And yet, as he stood on the precipice, with the vortex before him, the archivist could not help but feel a deep, gnawing fear. The archive was not just a collection of knowledge, he now realized. It was a living, breathing entity, and the knowledge it held was not always meant to be understood. There were truths, he sensed, that could shatter a mind, that could fracture the very fabric of reality itself. "You are not afraid, are you?" The auditioner's voice broke through the archivist's thoughts, smooth and melodic, yet carrying an edge of something older, something more knowing. The archivist turned to them, his eyes wide, his throat tight. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I thought I understood what I was searching for. But now I'm not sure." The auditioner regarded him quietly for a moment, their gaze steady and unwavering. "It is natural to feel uncertainty," they said at last. "The archive is a place of truths, but not all truths are kind. Some are too vast, too overwhelming to be borne by the human mind. And some truths are not meant to be known." The archivist's gaze flicked back to the vortex. He could feel it calling to him again, urging him forward, tempting him with the promise of knowledge. His hand twitched involuntarily, as if reaching out on its own, but his mind was no longer certain. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What truths are you talking about?" The auditioner's eyes softened, but there was a hardness to their voice that chilled the archivist. "The archive remembers everything," they said slowly, "but it does not judge. It is not the archive's role to choose what is revealed and what is kept hidden. That is a decision left to the one who seeks the knowledge. You are the one who must decide whether the truth is worth the cost. The archivist swallowed, his breath shallow. He had spent his entire life seeking the truth, had dedicated himself to uncovering the forgotten fragments of history, to understanding the mysteries of the world. But now, standing on the edge of this abyss, he felt the weight of what that truth might entail. He glanced again at the swirling light, at the vortex that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, and a sense of foreboding washed over him. What if this was a mistake? What if there were things buried in the archive that were never meant to see the light of day? The auditioner stepped forward then, closer than before, and placed a hand on the archivist's shoulder. The contact was surprisingly warm, grounding in a way that soothed the storm of doubt churning within him. "You have come this far," they said, their voice gentle but firm. "You cannot turn back now. The choice has already been made, whether you realize it or not. You came seeking the truth, and the archive will give you what you seek. But know this, not all truths are kind, and some, once learned, can never be forgotten." The words echoed in the archivist's mind as he stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to breathe. The weight of the decision loomed over him, heavy and oppressive. What if the truth he uncovered was more than he could handle? What if it broke him, consumed him? And yet, in his heart, he knew the answer. He had never truly been afraid of knowledge. Fear of the unknown had driven him forward for so long. But now, standing on the threshold of the archive's deepest secrets, it was fear of the known that gripped him. It was fear of the things he might learn, the things he might wish he had never known. He turned to the auditioner, his voice a hoarse whisper. "What happens if I step forward? What happens if I choose to know everything?" The auditioner did not immediately answer. Instead, they gazed at him with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of centuries, the burden of untold truths. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they spoke. "Then you will know," they said softly. "But what you know will change you. The truth you seek will not be what you expect. And once you have seen it, once you have truly seen it, there is no going back. You will become a part of the archive, a part of the knowledge you seek to understand. You will carry it with you always." The archivist's heart thudded in his chest as he processed the auditioner's words. The truth, whatever it was, would become a part of him, woven into his very being. There would be no separation between the seeker and the sought. The archive would consume him, and in return, he would hold the key to all its secrets. The vortex before him pulsed once more, sending a shiver down his spine. The light seemed to grow brighter, more intense, as if it were waiting for him to make his choice. There was no hesitation now, no more questioning. He had come for the truth, and the truth was here, within his reach. With a final, steadying breath, the archivist took a step forward, his hand reaching out toward the vortex. As his fingers brushed the swirling light, a jolt of energy surged through him, filling him with a sense of weightless clarity. It was as if the very fabric of reality had opened up before him, revealing the interconnectedness of everything: time, space, memory, and truth, all swirling in an infinite dance. And in that moment, he understood. He understood everything. The past, the present, the future. It was all laid bare before him. The knowledge was overwhelming, all-encompassing, and yet, despite the flood of information, he felt no fear, only a profound sense of connection, of belonging. But as the light began to fade, as the world around him began to solidify once more, the archivist realized that this knowledge, this truth, came with a price. For in that moment, he had not only become a part of the archive, he had become the archive itself. Chapter 11. When the past takes a bow. The archivist stood motionless, his hands still extended, fingertips grazing the edge of the vortex. He could feel it, deep within him. Something shifting, something irreversibly changing. The light, now fading from the intense brilliance it once held, wrapped around him like a living thing, weaving through his veins, threading itself into the very marrow of his bones. The knowledge poured into him, not as a torrent, but as a delicate stream that slowly infiltrated every part of him, like ink staining paper, like the first note of a song that would never end. He had expected to be overwhelmed. He had thought that the sheer weight of the archive's truths would crush him, that the vast expanse of knowledge would send him into madness. But it didn't. Instead, he felt whole. It was as if the knowledge was not an external thing at all, but something that had always been within him, just waiting to be unlocked. The faces, the voices, the memories, they were all there. They flooded his mind in waves. He saw the rise and fall of empires, the quiet lives of individuals who had never been recorded in any history, the whispered thoughts of those long gone, their secrets now his to carry. He understood the relationships between stars and dust, the delicate balance that had created the world and would one day unmake it. The knowledge was boundless, infinite, and yet, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a truth that connected everything in a way that was almost beautiful. He blinked, trying to make sense of the dizzying visions swirling around him. The archive was no longer a place, no longer a room or a chamber. It was part of him now, as if it had been absorbed into the very core of his existence. His mind stretched outward, reaching beyond the walls of the chamber, beyond the confines of time itself. He could feel the world turning, the past unfolding like a scroll before him, the future unraveling in a delicate thread of possibilities. But in the midst of this vast sea of knowledge, something stirred within him. A faint shadow, a flicker at the edge of his perception. It was subtle, but it was there. The truth was not the only thing within the archive. There was something else, something darker, something more dangerous. And it was aware of him. He pulled his hand back, breaking the connection with the vortex, but the pull of the archive remained. His heart thudded in his chest, the weight of what he had just absorbed pressing down on him like 1,000 hands. The silence of the chamber was deafening now, oppressive, as if the very air was holding its breath. The auditioner had not moved. They stood several steps away, observing him with an unreadable expression, their posture poised and calm. They had seen this before, he realized. They knew exactly what was happening to him, what had happened to him. Is this what you expected? The auditioner's voice cut through the stillness, smooth and distant, yet carrying a note of something like concern. Or perhaps it was something else, something the archivist couldn't name. The archivist opened his mouth to respond, but the words failed him. His throat was dry, constricted. He struggled to breathe, as if the air itself had become too dense, too full of meaning. He closed his eyes, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of thoughts and memories that were now flooding his consciousness. But the images were too much, too fast, and each fragment of knowledge felt like it was spiraling out of his control. He paused, trying to find his voice. I didn't realize. I thought I could understand it. But now it's too much. The auditioner tilted their head slightly, as though considering his words. You thought the truth would be a simple thing, they said softly. But it is not. The truth is not just knowledge. It is everything. And once you understand it, once you become a part of it, you cannot unlearn it. The archivist's eyes snapped open, his heart racing as the gravity of their words hit him. He had become a part of the archive. It was not just a collection of facts and events that he had accessed. It had merged with him. He was now as much a part of it as the memories and truths he had once sought. He was no longer just a seeker of knowledge. He had become the archive. His breath quickened, his chest tight with panic. He could feel it. Feel the archive's pulse in his veins, the weight of every secret, every piece of forgotten history pressing down on him. The archive was not just a passive entity. It lived. It breathed. And now, so did he. I can't breathe," he gasped, his hands trembling at his sides. "It's too much. It's like I'm drowning in it." The auditioner watched him for a moment, their expression still unreadable. Then, they took a step forward, their presence both calming and unsettling. "You will learn to breathe in it," they said, their voice quiet, almost soothing. "But it takes time. The archive does not give up its knowledge easily. It requires patience, understanding, and, most of all, control. You must learn to control it, or it will consume you." The archivist's mind raced as the auditioner's words sank in. Control. He had always sought knowledge, but he had never considered the price it would demand. He had imagined that the truth would be an object to be studied, something he could dissect and categorize. But the truth was not an object, it was an ocean, and he had plunged into its depths without understanding how to swim. Control. He repeated the word like a mantra, trying to ground himself in its meaning. He had always been in control of his quest for knowledge. He had always believed that his pursuit was guided by logic, by reason. But now, in the face of the archive's infinite vastness, he understood just how fragile that control was. He turned to the auditioner, his voice shaky but determined. How? How do I control it?" The auditioner studied him for a long moment, and for the first time since they had entered the chamber, the archivist saw a flicker of something in their eyes, something that almost looked like pity. "You must let go," they said softly. "You must release your need to understand everything. Only then will the archive allow you to truly see." The archivist recoiled, the words cutting deeper than he had expected. Let go? How could he let go of his pursuit? His entire life had been a quest for understanding, for unraveling the mysteries of the world. It was all he had ever known. But in that moment, he realized that the auditioner was right. To truly understand the archive, he would have to relinquish control. He would have to surrender himself to it, allow it to flow through him without resisting. And so, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, the archivist closed his eyes once more, willing himself to release the overwhelming flood of knowledge, to surrender to the archive's will. It would not be easy, but he was ready. Chapter 12. Behind the Velvet Curtain. The archivist's mind stretched outward again, but this time, he did not try to grasp at every fragment of knowledge that passed by. He did not seek to pull it all in, to hold it tightly within his grasp. Instead, he let it wash over him, like the tide pulling at the edges of the shore. He allowed the knowledge to come and go, without the frantic need to collect it. In that moment of surrender, he felt a strange sense of release. It was as though a great weight had been lifted from his chest, and for the first time since he had entered the archive, he could breathe again. The light in the chamber flickered, dimming to a soft glow as if the archive itself was responding to his shift in mindset. The vortex, once a swirling tempest of energy, now settled into something calmer, more still. The archivist dared to open his eyes, though the overwhelming sense of awareness still hummed beneath his skin, the archive's pulse now beating in rhythm with his own. The auditioner stood silently beside him, their presence more felt than seen, like the very air had been woven with their essence. They had not moved, had not spoken since their last words, but the archivist knew they were watching him, waiting for something, waiting for him to find the key to the knowledge that was now part of him. He stood still for a long moment, allowing the stillness to settle around him. The knowledge was there, ever present, but it no longer felt like a weight pressing down on him. It felt like a vast expanse, like the infinite horizon stretching out before him, full of possibility but not demanding his attention all at once. He could see it, the threads of time and memory, the lives of those who had come before him, the paths that had been taken and those that remained untraveled. He could feel the pulse of creation and destruction, the ebb and flow of the universe, and yet it did not consume him. The archivist felt something stir within him, a gentle pull toward the deeper, more hidden corners of the archive. He had unlocked a door, but there were still many others. The truth he had encountered so far was vast, but it was not the whole picture. He could feel there was more to uncover, more to understand. Do you feel it? The auditioner's voice came softly, breaking the stillness that had settled in the room. The tone was not one of question, but of knowing, as though they had expected this moment. The archivist turned to them, his mind clear, his thoughts no longer a whirlwind of confusion. There was a quiet strength in his gaze now, as if he had crossed a threshold within himself. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, his voice steady, almost in awe. "It's different now. The knowledge is, it's not as overwhelming as I thought it would be. I feel connected to it, like I am part of it, not separate from it." The auditioner studied him for a long moment, their expression unreadable. But the archivist could sense something in their gaze, something that softened in response to his words. The archive does not simply give its knowledge away, they said, their voice low and almost reverent. It binds you to it. To understand the archive is not to collect information, it is to become part of it. You are no longer just an observer. You are a participant in its story. The archivist let their words settle into his mind, and for a moment, he considered them carefully. He had come seeking knowledge, but he had never expected to be so fundamentally altered by it. He had thought he would remain himself, separate from the truths he uncovered. But now, it seemed, he was intertwined with the archive in ways he could not fully comprehend. It was a strange sensation, as though his very identity was in flux, not because he was losing himself, but because he was becoming something larger, something more expansive. The archive was not a collection of books or scrolls or forgotten memories. It was alive. It was a living, breathing entity that had taken root within him, that had woven its threads into the fabric of his existence. He was not just the archivist anymore. He was a part of the archive itself. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes once more, allowing himself to sink deeper into this new understanding. He could feel the weight of his decision now, not as a burden, but as a deep responsibility. To hold knowledge was not the same as to live it. The truths that had become part of him were not static. They were dynamic, ever-shifting, constantly unfolding. They were not meant to be hoarded, but to be understood, to be shared in some way, to be lived. Will it always be like this? The question slipped from his lips before he could stop it, a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. Will I always feel this, connected to everything? The auditioner did not answer immediately. Instead, they took a slow step forward, their presence becoming more tangible, as though they were drawing closer to something important. "You are not the first to experience this," they said, their voice quiet but resonant. "Many have come before you, drawn to the archive by the same thirst for knowledge. Some sought to control it, to claim it as their own. But the archive does not bend to anyone's will. It chooses who can bear its weight." The archivist felt a flicker of unease at the auditioner's words. What happens to those who cannot bear it? The auditioner's gaze softened, and for the first time, the archivist caught a glimpse of something like compassion in their eyes. "Some lose themselves," they said gently. "Some are consumed by the archive's knowledge, and it becomes their undoing. But others find their way. They learn to live with it, to find peace within the chaos." The archivist's heart raced, a surge of fear welling up within him. The idea of losing himself, of being swallowed whole by the archive, was something he had not fully considered. He had thought the truth would be a guide, a source of clarity, but now he wondered if it might overwhelm him, if it might destroy him. "You must understand," the auditioner continued, their voice calm, almost reassuring. "The archive does not seek to break you. It only seeks to reveal what has been hidden. But you must be willing to let go of the need to control everything. To understand the archive, you must become its servant, not its master." The words settled into his mind, heavy with meaning. The archivist realized that he was at a crossroads. The knowledge he had sought had changed him irrevocably, but it was not enough to simply possess it. He had to learn how to live with it, how to let it flow through him without being overwhelmed. He had to surrender. The realization hit him with a quiet finality. To truly understand the archive, he would need to let go of everything he thought he knew. He would need to surrender to its vastness, to its infinite truths, and allow himself to become part of its story, not just as a seeker, but as a keeper. With that understanding, the archivist let go. Chapter 13. The Language of Longing. The archivist stood in the center of the chamber, his mind still and yet brimming with the weight of everything he had become. The archive had settled within him like a seed, taking root and slowly spreading its tendrils through every corner of his being. The light had dimmed, but it had not faded. It lingered in the air, as though it too had found a new place within him, a new rhythm that resonated with the pulse of his thoughts. He had let go of his desire for control, but in doing so, he had not surrendered himself completely. Not yet. The auditioner remained beside him, their presence quiet and constant. There was no judgment in their gaze, no pressure to move forward, only a silent invitation to continue. They were not his guide, not in the way he had once imagined. They were something else, something more. "You've begun to see the truth," the auditioner said, their voice like a soft whisper in the stillness of the room. "But knowing the truth is only the first step. The real challenge is understanding what to do with it." The archivist turned toward them, feeling a stir of something new within him. A curiosity, a question that he had not fully articulated until now. He had been swept up in the experience of the archive, in the flood of knowledge. But now that the initial tide had receded, he felt something else. Something that was not quite fear, but close to it. The magnitude of the truth he had uncovered, the enormity of the responsibility it carried, weighed heavily on him. "And what am I supposed to do with it?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge to it now, a note of uncertainty that had not been there before. The auditioner did not immediately answer. Instead, they took a step toward him, their figures standing tall and composed, yet somehow distant, as though they were already looking beyond this moment to something far further away. "The truth you have gained is not just yours," they said, their words deliberate, each one carrying the weight of meaning. "It belongs to the world. It belongs to everyone who has ever lived, to everyone who will come after you." The archivist's chest tightened at their words. He had suspected this, but hearing it so plainly felt like a weight pressing against his lungs. "But if it belongs to everyone, how can anyone hold it? How can we make sense of it if it's not meant to be kept?" The auditioner's eyes softened slightly, though their expression remained impassive. "The archive does not exist to be kept," they said. "It exists to be shared. The knowledge within it is meant to be experienced, to be understood, but it is not yours to control. You cannot hoard it, and you cannot force others to understand it in the way you do. It is their right to come to it in their own time, in their own way." The archivist's heart began to race. His mind whirled with thoughts he could not yet fully grasp. He had come here seeking the answers to the great mysteries of existence, to unlock the truths that had been hidden for so long. But now, he saw that those answers were not meant to be possessed, not meant to be parceled out like pieces of a puzzle. The truth was a living thing, and it could not be confined. But if I can see it, if I can understand it, why can't I share it with others? He asked, his voice thick with frustration. Why can't I show them what I've found? The auditioner looked at him for a long moment, their gaze penetrating, as though they were looking into the very heart of his soul. Because not everyone is ready, they said finally, their voice soft but resolute. Some truths are too heavy to bear, too much for a single person to carry. You must learn to discern who can bear it, who can understand it. And even then, you must tread carefully. The truth, when it is revealed too suddenly, can shatter a person's world. It can destroy them. The archivist's pulse quickened, and for the first time, he felt the full weight of what he had become. He had thought that uncovering the truth was a noble pursuit, that sharing it would be an act of enlightenment, of generosity. But now, he understood. Truth could be a double-edged sword. It could heal, but it could also break. He glanced down at his hands, half expecting to see them trembling. But they were steady. His body was steady, even as his mind reeled. He could feel the presence of the archive, alive within him, like a current running through his veins. The knowledge was not just his. It was everything. It was the past, the present, and the future. It was the lives of those who had lived before him, and the countless lives that would follow. He could feel it all. He could see it all. I don't know if I can handle it, he said quietly, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. I don't know if I can live with it. The auditioner studied him for a long time, as though measuring the depths of his struggle. You are not alone in this, they said, their voice steady and reassuring. You have not been chosen to bear this knowledge by chance. You are part of a long line of seekers, of those who have come before you and those who will come after you. You are connected to all of them, to all of us, and we will help you find your way. The archivist raised his head, meeting their gaze. But what if I'm not strong enough? What if I fail? The auditioner's expression softened, and for the first time, they reached out, their hand hovering just above his shoulder, not quite touching him but close enough to offer a silent comfort. Strength is not always about holding on, they said. Sometimes it is about letting go. Sometimes it is about surrendering to what you cannot control. The archivist closed his eyes at their words, feeling the weight of his responsibility settle once more. He had wanted to control the truth, to master it, to wield it. But now, he saw the folly in that desire. The truth was not meant to be mastered. It was meant to be lived. When he opened his eyes again, he was no longer the same. The knowledge was still there, deep within him, but he had learned to breathe with it, to be with it. It was no longer a force that threatened to drown him. It was a current he could navigate, a stream that could carry him forward if he allowed it. I understand now, he said softly, his voice steady. It's not about controlling the truth. It's about letting it flow through me, letting it shape me, without trying to force it into something it's not. The auditioner nodded, a faint smile playing at the edges of their lips. Exactly. And in that moment, the archivist understood something else, something even deeper than the knowledge the archive had given him. He understood that to truly live with the truth, he had to embrace it, not as something to be conquered, but as something to be honored. He would not be its master. He would be its servant, its keeper. And with that realization, he felt something shift within him, something light and freeing, as if a weight he had not even known he was carrying had finally lifted. Chapter 14, Tides of the Final Act. The archivist stood in the center of the chamber, his heart steady in its newfound rhythm. The overwhelming surge of knowledge that had once threatened to consume him now flowed gently around him, like a calm river that he had learned to navigate. It was no longer a flood, but a steady stream. It no longer defined him. It merely was. He had become a vessel, not of his own design, but one shaped by the hands of something far greater than he. The auditioner had not moved since they had shared their quiet wisdom with him. They had stepped back, giving him space to absorb the gravity of their words. There had been no urging, no pressure. They had allowed him to simply be, to process what he had learned. But now, the silence between them was heavy, both of them standing on the precipice of something that neither could name, and yet both knew it was coming. The archivist finally broke the silence, his voice softer than he had intended. "I understand now," he repeated, as though the words were still settling into place within him. "I'm not meant to control the truth, to own it. I'm meant to live with it, to let it shape me and in turn, let it shape the world around me." The auditioner nodded, their face unreadable as ever. But the subtle shift in their posture told the archivist that they were acknowledging something significant. "Yes," they said simply, "but understanding the truth is only the beginning. What you do with it from here will determine the path you walk." The archivist could feel a twinge of uncertainty stir in his chest. He had thought, in the beginning, that discovering the truth would be the hardest part. He had been so consumed by the pursuit of knowledge, so eager to claim it as his own, that he had never considered what came after. Now, the enormity of what lay before him was beginning to take shape. "But how?" he asked, a hint of desperation creeping into his voice. "How do I know what to do with it? How can I ensure that I don't use it wrongly?" The auditioner turned their gaze to the vast expanse beyond them, as though looking at something only they could see. "The truth is not something you can control. It is not a tool to be wielded for personal gain or power. It is a force, an energy that runs through everything. It cannot be possessed, only understood. And the way you use it will depend on your intent." The archivist considered their words carefully, a strange sense of foreboding growing within him. "But isn't intent subjective? How can I be certain that my intent is pure, that I am using the truth for the right reasons?" The auditioner turned to him, their eyes meeting his with a piercing clarity. "That is the heart of the challenge. You must look inward, deep within yourself, and ask if your actions are in alignment with the greater good, not just your own good. The truth cannot be separated from the world it exists in. It is not about your individual desires. It is about the balance, the harmony of all things." The archivist's mind raced, the weight of their words sinking deep into his core. He had always been so focused on the pursuit of knowledge, on understanding what lay beyond the surface. But now, he realized that the knowledge itself was only part of the equation. The real challenge was living with it in a way that honored the delicate balance of all things. "How do I know when I've found that balance?" he asked, the question more to himself than to the auditioner. "How do I know when I've truly understood the responsibility of what I now carry?" The auditioner stepped forward, their figure looming slightly larger, as if they were offering him some intangible reassurance. "You will feel it," they said softly. "The weight of it will not crush you. It will settle into your bones, and you will know when the time is right to act. You will know when you are ready." The archivist swallowed, the quiet unease that had been stirring in him growing stronger. "And what happens if I'm not ready? What if I make a mistake?" The auditioner was silent for a long moment, their gaze distant as if they were contemplating something far beyond him. When they spoke again, their voice was softer than it had ever been. "Mistakes are part of the journey," they said gently. "We all make them. But the question is not whether or not you will err. The question is whether you can learn from your mistakes, whether you can find your way back, even after you've lost your path." The archivist took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, trying to grasp onto something that felt solid in the whirlwind of thoughts that surrounded him. "So, it's not about perfection," he murmured. "It's about learning, about becoming." The auditioner gave a faint nod, as if this was the answer they had been waiting for him to discover on his own. "Yes, the truth is not a destination. It is a journey, a process of constant growth." The archive may have revealed its secrets to you, but now it is up to you to decide how to carry them forward. To decide what kind of archivist you will be. The archivist felt a sudden, sharp pang of realization, like the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. He had spent so long seeking the truth, desperate to unlock its secrets, to claim it as his own. But the truth had never been about possession. It had always been about understanding. And understanding, he now saw, was not a fixed thing. It was a living, breathing process, something that changed with each moment, with each new experience. "But how do I begin?" he asked, a quiet desperation in his voice. "How do I take what I've learned and apply it?" The auditioner's eyes softened, their expression becoming almost reflective. "The beginning is always the hardest," they said, almost to themselves. "But you've already started. The knowledge is within you now. The first step is to accept the weight of it, to live with it without fear, to know that you do not need to have all the answers. You simply need to trust that you are on the right path." The archivist nodded slowly, taking in their words. The journey ahead of him was not clear, but it was his to navigate. He would not have all the answers, but perhaps that was not the point. Perhaps the point was to simply walk forward, step by step, learning as he went. The archive would continue to pulse within him, a constant reminder of the vastness of what he now carried. But it was no longer something that threatened to overwhelm him. It was a part of him, a part of the world. For the first time, the archivist understood what it meant to be truly alive within the archive. The silence stretched between them again. But this time it was different. It was not the weight of uncertainty that filled the space, but the quiet hum of understanding. The archivist knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that there would be times when he would stumble, when he would doubt himself. But he also knew that the truth he had uncovered was not something that would ever abandon him. It would guide him, if only he was brave enough to follow. Chapter 15. Beneath the spotlight's glow. The archivist stood at the threshold of the archive, the immense door now open before him. He had passed through its unyielding frame so many times, but each time had felt like a journey into the unknown. The vastness of the room beyond was both familiar and foreign, like a dream half remembered. And yet, now, standing at the edge of it, he felt something else. A quiet certainty that had been slowly taking shape within him. He had begun to understand that the archive was no longer a place of mere discovery. It was a place of becoming. He felt the auditioner's presence behind him, though they had not spoken for some time. Their silence was no longer an absence, but a steady companion. A reminder that words were not always necessary to understand what was unfolding. He had learned to trust the stillness between them, the quiet understanding that had developed in the space where words had once been the only bridge between their worlds. The archivist turned, meeting the auditioner's gaze. There was no judgment there, only a gentle recognition, as though they knew this moment had arrived in its own time. "I'm ready," he said, the words escaping him with more certainty than he had expected. The auditioner said nothing, but their eyes softened slightly. They did not need to respond. The archivist had reached this place on his own, and their role was simply to witness. He had come to understand that the truth he had uncovered, the knowledge that now flowed through him like an endless stream, was not just for him to hold. It was for the world. It was to be shared, not as a possession, but as a gift, one that could change everything, but only if it was carried with the right intent. He turned back to face the archive, feeling the weight of the door as it closed gently behind him. He had thought, in the beginning, that the archive was a place of unending discovery, that it held all the answers to all the questions he had ever asked. But now, he understood that the answers were not the point. The real challenge had never been in knowing. It had always been in doing. The knowledge he carried within him was a weight he could no longer ignore. It had settled into his bones, into the quiet spaces between his breaths. It was no longer something to possess or control. It was something to be lived, and the only way to live with it was to share it, to offer it to the world, even when the world was not ready for it. But how could he be sure? How could he know who was ready, who could bear the weight of the truth without breaking under its pressure? The auditioner's words echoed in his mind. You must discern who can bear it. But that was easier said than done. The truth was a force of nature. It could heal, but it could also destroy. He could not simply hand it to anyone. He had learned that much already. The archivist moved slowly through the archive, his fingers brushing against the ancient scrolls and brittle pages that lined the shelves. Each one held a story, a truth, a moment frozen in time. The knowledge of the past, the present, and the future was contained in these walls, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. But how could he choose which moment was the right one? How could he know who was ready for the truth he carried? He stopped in front of one of the oldest tomes, its pages worn and fragile with age. It had been a part of the archive for longer than he had been alive, its secrets hidden within its folds, waiting to be discovered. He reached for it, his hands trembling ever so slightly as he pulled it from the shelf. The moment the book was in his hands, he felt the connection, like a thread being pulled through his chest, tying him to the wisdom contained within. He could feel the truth of the book, its knowledge flowing through him, just as the archive had flowed through him. It was not just the contents of the book that mattered, but the way it had lived within the archive for so long, waiting for someone to uncover it. But what if no one was ready? What if the knowledge contained in the archive was too much for the world to bear? The archivist felt a surge of doubt rise within him, threatening to pull him under. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He had to trust that the world was capable of more than he could understand. He had to trust that the truth, once shared, would find its place in the world, even if it wasn't the place he had imagined. His fingers traced the delicate script on the page, his mind filled with questions. Questions about the future, about the lives that would be touched by the knowledge contained within these walls. Could he truly make a difference? Could the truth he now carried change anything at all? The sound of footsteps behind him brought him back to the present. He turned to find the auditioner standing in the doorway, their presence like a quiet pulse in the air. Their gaze was steady, and though they had not spoken, he knew they were waiting for him to make the next move. You must decide, the auditioner said, their voice calm and unwavering. What will you do with the knowledge you carry? The archivist swallowed, the weight of their question settling over him like a heavy cloak. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he felt the gravity of it all. He had learned so much, seen so much, but now he understood that the real test was not in the knowing, it was in the doing. He closed the book gently, holding it against his chest. The weight of it felt different now, heavier, but somehow lighter at the same time. He was not alone in this. He had the knowledge, but he also had the responsibility to share it. He could no longer hide behind the safety of the archive. It was time to step out into the world and offer the truth, even if it meant risking everything. I will share it, he said quietly, his voice steady, but I will do so with caution, with care. I will not force anyone to accept it, but I will offer it to those who are ready. I will give them the chance to choose. The auditioner nodded once, their eyes filled with something that could have been pride, though they never allowed themselves to show it fully. That is the right choice, they said simply. But remember, the truth is not always easy to bear. Be patient with those who are not ready. And be patient with yourself. The archivist nodded, feeling the weight of their words settle deep within him. It was not about knowing the truth. It was about living with it, carrying it with grace and humility, and sharing it when the time was right. As he turned back to the archive, ready to begin the next phase of his journey, he understood one thing above all else. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk, ready to hear it. And with that understanding, The archivist took his first step into the world beyond the archive, carrying with him the weight of all that he had learned, and the responsibility to share it with those who were ready to hear it. Chapter 16. The Archivist Revelation. The archivist stood at the edge of the town, looking out at the familiar scenes spread before him. The narrow cobblestone streets wound their way through buildings with worn facades, the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air from the bakery at the corner. The bustling of everyday life hummed around him, people going about their business, oblivious to the weight of the knowledge he carried within. It was a sight he had once found comforting, a reminder of the world he had always known. But now, with the truth pulsing in his veins, it felt different. It felt as though the world was both too small and too vast all at once. The ordinary lives of the people before him seemed to exist in a kind of fragile harmony, each person moving through their day unaware of the deeper currents flowing just beneath the surface. He could no longer see the world in the same way. The archive had opened his eyes to so much more, truths about the past, the present, and the future. He now knew the connections that bound the world together, the invisible threads that wove through every moment and every life. And yet, for all the knowledge he now possessed, he still did not know how to navigate it. He did not know how to share it, or if he even should. The question lingered, heavy and persistent. Who was he to decide who was ready for the truth? His hand clenched at his side, the weight of the book still pressing against him. It had become more than just an object. It had become a part of him, a constant reminder of the responsibility he carried. The truth he held was not his to possess. It was meant to be shared, to be given to the world. But how? And when? The wind picked up, rustling the leaves of a nearby tree, and the archivist took a slow breath, trying to steady his mind. He had chosen to share the truth, yes, but now, standing here, he felt the enormity of that choice. There was no going back. There was no way to undo what he had decided. And yet, he was still not certain of the path forward. Do you doubt yourself, Archivist? The voice came from behind him, soft yet steady, and the Archivist turned to see the Auditioner standing just a few paces away. Their presence was a quiet force, a grounding that reminded him that he was not alone, even in the weight of his uncertainty. I don't know, he admitted, his voice rough with the burden of it all. I've chosen to share the truth, but how do I know if it's the right time? How do I know who can bear it? What if I make a mistake? What if I give it to someone who isn't ready and it breaks them? The Auditioner regarded him with a steady gaze, their expression unreadable as always. The truth will find its place, Archivist. Whether you give it or not, it will make its way into the world. But you have the choice. You can offer it and give others the chance to decide for themselves. The Archivist's heart thundered in his chest as he considered their words. The Auditioner was right. The truth would find its way into the world regardless of his actions. But by withholding it, he was taking away the opportunity for others to make their own choices. He was standing in the way of their potential growth, of their ability to face the truth and decide what to do with it. What if I can't bear to watch them struggle? He asked, the weight of the question pressing down on him. What if I give them something they aren't ready for, and it causes them pain? The Auditioner stepped forward, their presence like a quiet breeze, as though their very being offered calm amidst the storm of the Archivist's thoughts. The truth is not something to be feared, Archivist. It is something to be lived. Pain is a part of the process. It is through struggle that we grow, that we learn, that we change. But you cannot protect others from that. They must choose it for themselves, just as you have chosen to carry it. The Archivist felt a wave of frustration rise within him. But what if they don't choose it? What if they turn away from it? Or worse, use it for their own selfish ends? How do I know that my choice will lead to something good? The Auditioner's gaze softened, their voice gentle yet firm. You do not know. That is the nature of choice. You cannot control the outcome, nor can you predict what others will do with the truth. All you can do is offer it, and trust that it will have its impact in the way it is meant to. The archivist closed his eyes, taking in their words. It was the uncertainty that unsettled him the most, the inability to control the consequences of his actions. He had always prided himself on knowing, on understanding the path ahead. But now, with the knowledge he carried, he realized that certainty was a luxury he could no longer afford. He could no longer see the world through a lens of absolute right and wrong. The truth was far too complex for that. "Is it enough?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it enough to simply offer the truth without knowing what will happen next?" The auditioner did not answer immediately. They stood still, allowing the question to settle in the space between them. Finally, they spoke, their words measured but profound. "Sometimes, Archivist, the act of offering is the greatest gift you can give. It is not the outcome that matters most, it is the choice to share. The truth does not need to be understood all at once. It may take years, decades, or even lifetimes for someone to fully grasp its weight. But you can trust that by offering it, you are planting a seed. And that seed will grow in its own time." The archivist felt the weight of their words sink in. It wasn't about controlling the outcome. It wasn't about knowing what would happen next. It was about the act of sharing, of allowing others the chance to make their own decisions. He could not bear the weight of the world on his shoulders. He could not carry the burden of knowing for everyone else. He could only offer what he had discovered and trust that it would find its place in the world. Taking a deep breath, the archivist looked once more at the town before him. The people continued on with their lives, unaware of the vast shift taking place within him. But he knew now that the world would never be the same. The truth would change it, in ways both subtle and profound. And he was part of that change. With a quiet resolve, the archivist turned to the auditioner. "I will offer it," he said, his voice steady now. "I will share the truth, but I will do so with care. I will give others the chance to choose for themselves." The auditioner nodded, their eyes filled with something that could have been pride, though their face remained unreadable. "That is all anyone can do, Archivist. You are not alone in this. The truth is a part of the world, just as you are. And now, you are ready to share it." The archivist nodded, feeling the weight of their approval settle in his chest. It was a heavy thing, this knowledge he carried, but it was also a gift that could change everything if only others were ready to accept it. And so, with that understanding, the archivist began the next phase of his journey. The path ahead was uncertain, but he knew one thing for certain. He would no longer walk it alone. Chapter 17. An Open Curtain. The archivist stood at the edge of the village square, the morning sun casting long shadows across the cobblestones. He had walked through these streets countless times before, his feet familiar with every turn, every crack in the stone, yet today the world seemed foreign to him. The knowledge he carried within him had shifted everything. Nothing looked the same, not even the people he had known for years. As he watched the people move about their daily routines, he wondered who among them was ready for the truth he carried, who would see the weight of it and understand. He had decided to offer the truth, yes, but now that he stood on the threshold, he felt the enormity of that choice pressed down upon him. What if they rejected it? What if they turned away, unable to comprehend the vastness of the knowledge he held? Would the truth be too much for them to bear? The archivist's heart thudded in his chest as the question swirled in his mind. But he knew there was no turning back now. He had made his choice. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the stone as he moved deeper into the village. He walked without a clear destination, allowing the rhythm of his steps to guide him. His mind was a whirl of thoughts, but each step brought him closer to his purpose, even if he couldn't yet see what that purpose would fully be. The village square was bustling with activity. A vendor called out to a passing customer, offering fresh vegetables from the market stall. Children ran past, their laughter ringing in the air as they played their games, their joy untouched by the weight of the world beyond their small village. And yet, the archivist knew that even here, in this seemingly quiet corner of the world, the truth he carried could change everything. He passed by a familiar face, an elderly woman sitting outside her cottage, her hands working with a basket of linen. She had been a part of this village for as long as he could remember. She looked up at him with a warm smile, a glint of recognition in her eyes. "Good morning, Archivist," she called out, her voice gentle but firm. "You seem troubled, my boy. Is something wrong?" The archivist paused, taken aback by her perceptiveness. He had expected to pass unnoticed, to slip quietly into the crowd. But her eyes, sharp despite her years, saw through him in a way he hadn't anticipated. "It's nothing," he replied quickly, offering her a half-hearted smile. "Just thinking." The woman studied him for a moment, her gaze unwavering. "The world is full of things to think about, isn't it? But sometimes, boy, it's not the thinking that matters. It's the doing." Her words were simple, but they struck him with the force of something deeper. The doing. That was what he had been struggling with, wasn't it? The truth he carried was not a thing to be kept in silence, in the quiet corners of his mind. It had to be shared, but the act of sharing was terrifying. What if the doing was more than he was ready for? What if it broke him in the process? Before he could respond, the woman gave him a knowing smile and turned back to her work, as though she had already said everything that needed to be said. The archivist watched her for a moment, her hands moving with practiced ease as she folded the linen, and he felt a quiet reassurance settle within him. She had not asked him for the truth. She had not even hinted at it. But she had reminded him of something important. The world was full of things to do, and all he could do was take the next step. With a deep breath, the archivist turned and continued on his path, his mind still heavy with questions, but his heart a little lighter. The village had not changed, not in the way he had expected. The people here were still living their lives, unaware of the storm that brewed within him. He realized now that it was not the world that needed to change. It was his perspective on it that needed to shift. He made his way toward the edge of the village, where the old stone chapel stood, its spire reaching toward the sky like a silent prayer. He had spent many hours in the chapel in his youth, the quiet space offering him a refuge from the noise of the world. It was here that he had first learned to read, to understand the stories of the past that filled the pages of the archive. It was here, in the stillness, that he had first begun to seek answers. But today, the chapel seemed different. The silence that had once offered solace now felt like a weight pressing down upon him. He entered the chapel slowly, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was cool and still, the faint scent of incense lingering in the air. He moved to the front of the room, where the altar stood, bathed in soft light filtering through the stained glass windows. The archivist stood there for a long moment, looking up at the intricate depictions of saints and angels that adorned the glass. The colors shifted with the changing light, creating patterns on the floor that seemed to dance in rhythm with his thoughts. It was beautiful, yes, but now it felt distant, like a memory of something he could no longer fully touch. He closed his eyes, seeking the quiet peace he had once found in places like this. The stillness of the chapel seemed to envelop him, and for a moment, he was lost in the serenity of it all. But even in the silence, the weight of the truth he carried pressed down on him. The truth was not something he could escape, not something he could hide from in the cool shadows of the chapel. It was with him always, a constant companion, both a comfort and a burden. When he opened his eyes again, he knew what he had to do. The world outside the chapel was waiting, and it was time for him to take the next step. The truth he carried was not just for him. It was for the people of this village and for the world beyond. He could no longer hide from it. The archivist took a final, steadying breath and turned to leave the chapel. He felt a shift within him, a quiet understanding that the path ahead was uncertain, but it was his to walk. And no matter how heavy the truth might feel, it was not something he could carry alone. As he stepped out into the light of day, he knew that the journey ahead would not be easy. But he also knew that it was a journey he could not avoid. The truth was not something that could be contained forever. It was something to be lived, to be shared. And as he walked back toward the village square, the archivist finally understood the weight of silence. Silence was not the absence of words. It was the presence of everything unspoken, everything waiting to be revealed. And he, with all his knowledge, was the one who would finally give it voice.